Hi everyone, Lee Pacchia here, and you are watching The Business of Law, the only web TV show focusing on both the challenges and the opportunities facing the legal profession. We have a really interesting show for you today. We're going to take a look at what's happening in the legal market in the United Kingdom. My guest is Mark Cohen. He is the founder of Legalmosaic. He's joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. Mark, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, Lee. Thanks.
So, wanted to start off by talking about this article we were talking about in Legal Futures from last week, where essentially an entity called Mimesis Law is telegraphing plans to do essentially a roll-up of 60 some odd law firms. Pretty interesting experience reading this article as an American because as a lawyer, it struck me as something that's just really not feasible in the United States, at least from a regulatory standpoint, but also as someone who follows finance and economics, roll-ups are part of life in modern capitalism. So I'm having a hard time figuring out just how I feel about this article. I wanted to ask you to see what you thought about it.
Sure. Well, I think the way you pose the question raises a number of interesting subparts. Let's start with the fact that you're viewing it, as you say, through the prism of someone on this side of the pond. The regulatory divide between the way the environment in which lawyers practice here in the States and what is available to them in England and in other former Commonwealth nations are quite different environments. Let me just preliminarily, sort of at a high level, stress some of the fundamental differences, which I think will shed a little light on the particular question you're posing about this roll-up.
Please.
So first of all, let's start with the fact that in England, they are operating under a regulatory scheme which many Americans mistakenly think is deregulation. It is not. It is just re-regulation of rules which at one time were similar to the United States in that they, number one, prevented lawyers from profit sharing with so-called non-lawyers, read anyone who is not a lawyer. Mm-hmm. Number two, prevented lawyers from having equity interests in a law firm. Number three, prevented non-lawyers from assuming senior management or ownership roles in law firms. Finally, created a climate where it was a kind of us against the rest of the world mentality that lawyers had, mm-hmm. Which sort of enters into, I think, the legal ethos in this country, which persists.
So what you're describing is essentially a completely different economic landscape for entities that give out legal advice, right?
That is precisely right. Now, I hasten to say that there are a number of companies in this country. I was the co-founder of one of them called ClearSpire that found, sort of creative workarounds, the somewhat, I would characterize it as oppressive and somewhat archaic regulatory climate of the United States. But they are still somewhat in the minority, whereas in England, it's much more of law being recognized both as a profession and as a business. And I think that is why you are seeing not only the article that you're referring to, which I'm sure we can get to in a little more detail in a moment, but also you're seeing not just a tidal wave, but a tsunami of legal innovation that is centered in the UK and then proliferating out across the rest of the world, right, save the United States.
Would you say that the divergence is affecting all levels of the profession, or is it mostly something that's relegated to medium law and small law without really touching big law yet?
Well, the irony of your question, which is a very good one, is that one would think in this country that the impact would be more in terms of relaxed regulations in the retail space. But it's actually quite the opposite. And what you find here is that in the States, um, companies like LegalZoom, which clearly do not purport to engage in the practice of law, but rather deliver legal products and then augment those products with the opportunity to consult with a lawyer. Those are companies that absolutely get hit time and time again with unauthorized practice of law claims brought, ironically, by lawyers. And so the retail part of the US market is seeing very little impact in terms of these so-called new types of service providers. On the other hand, let's look at the corporate side of the market. And probably the most significant example I could give of an impact that a service provider, meaning a non-law firm, has had recently on the legal marketplace is Axiom recently signed a $73 million deal to do fairly sophisticated work for a large financial institution. It was undisclosed, but I think it's a well-known secret, known by most, that it was Credit Suisse. And this is a $73 million deal. And no one is even breathing a word of unauthorized practice. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy in the States in terms of the two segments of the market. The corporate side, which is beginning to see the exercise of influence exerted by service providers, and the retail side, where lawyers are very, very tenaciously clinging to their turf.
Mark, let's drill down on the Metamorph situation. They said in the article that they ideally, within 5 years, would like to have all of these entities, law firms, rolled up into something called an ABS. Can you walk us through the concept and tell us why it's so important?
Sure. Well, first of all, an ABS is an acronym for an alternative business structure. And that is basically something that is available, as I said before, in the UK, not available here. Companies have to go through a licensing process, which has become, I'm told, much easier to do as time goes on. And this enables them to do the kinds of things that this particular project is seeking to do. That is, getting outside capital to provide the money necessary to do the roll-up. That, of course, is something which could not be done for law firms in this side of the pond, but could, of course, be done in connection with service providers, even here in the States. So you could have a roll-up of service providers.
So I'm getting the sense from talking to you that there's a risk here that the United States could be left behind as legal markets like the one in the United Kingdom accelerates the pace of change in innovation. Would that be so far as putting words in your mouth?
No, I think your inference is very well and accurately drawn. In fact, let me give you another example of why I would argue that not only is the UK now the epicenter of legal innovation, or just to put it another way, where it's happening, but also it's a gateway for globalization of legal services. If you take a look at Dentons, which is now the largest law firm in terms of headcount and number of offices in the world, Dentons recently did a fairly remarkable deal with one of the largest Chinese law firms. And that is something that just could not be done today by a US law firm. And Dentons made good use of a type of structure called Swiss Verein, which is available to US firms, but was able, basically utilizing the UK's more business-oriented, relaxed, and I should say client-centric regulatory scheme to do this, pretty bold pairing with a large Chinese firm.
Mm-hmm. And we're also seeing some interesting developments out of the Big Four. KPMG announced that they're going to enter the legal services market in Australia. There's a lot happening out there. At what point in the future, if at all, do you think the regulators in the United States will wake up and realize that it might be time to change the way things are done in this country?
Well, I know that there's some animated discussion that's ongoing on that very issue. I just recently spoke at a global symposium that dealt with that. And all I can tell you is that the split in terms of the way the rest of the world views the future and, in fact, the present of the delivery of legal services versus those people who are on the so-called 2020 Commission of the ABA, charged with looking at, re-regulation. The split was just absolutely breathtaking. I think what's going to happen, Lee, is as UK-based firms are beginning to really outpace U.S. firms in terms of their ability to capture the burgeoning Asian market and other, growing markets around the world. I think it's going to be a perhaps late wake-up call for U.S. regulators. And I would just say that again, it's interesting to note that LegalZoom, who I mentioned earlier, LegalZoom has gone over to the UK and has quietly gotten an ABS license. And so too, by the way, has one of the very white shoe New York firms, Cahill Gordon, through their English office or LLP, Cahill London, has secured an ABS. That should tell you something.
So Cahill London can go out and raise outside capital to fund operations?
Correct.
That's pretty wild.
It's pretty wild.
We live in interesting times. Mark, fascinating stuff. Thanks for talking to us today, and I'm sure we're going to have you back on the program again soon to talk about these developments as we go forward. That's Mark Cohen from Legalmosaic. If you'd like to see more of the stuff we're working on, be sure to go check us out online. You can find us at mimesislaw.com. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I'm Lee Pacchia. Thanks for watching.